Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we are going to simply ask one question before we get started. Is it possible to bring back from the dead an old school deck archetype from the modern format into Arena in the historic format and see how scary it can still be?
Good question.
Well, there's only one way to find out, so follow me today as we celebrate Halloween by bringing back from the dead the old school archetype from Modern, one of the most terrifying decks, and see how we can make it work in Arena. This is how you Jund them out in 2023. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Whether you're a longtime viewer or you're a new person watching the channel, we have to talk about the stats, of course, before we get started. So we're working with the Jund colors, as I mentioned earlier today. For those of you who are Arena Zoomers, those are the Riveters colors that you saw from New Capenna. But either way, however you slice it, it's basically black, red, and green. You're looking at an average mana curve of about 2.3. You're rocking 17 creatures in this deck, 6 instants, 7 sorceries, 4 enchantments, 3 planeswalkers, and 23 lands. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and let's talk about what makes this deck so scary, even in 2023. We're obviously going to try to maintain as much of the integrity of the original core of Jund. So in other words, we have cards like Tarmogoyf here. For those of you who are Zoomers out there, let's educate you real quick on why this card was so terrifying back in the day. Tarmogoyf here is a 2-mana creature Lurthgoyf that has an asterisk and +1 in its defense. Basically, Tarmogoyf's power is equal to the number of cards types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Whew, that's a little bit confusing to word. Long story short, basically, for every card type that we have in here, it gets a little bit stronger, and as even if we have nothing in the graveyard, at the very least, at its weakest, it's a 0/1, but it gets a lot more stronger as the game progresses. Obviously, one of the biggest reasons why this card is such a dangerous card in Modern is they had a lot of fetch lands. We don't have really any fetch lands in Arena with the exception of Fable Passage. Still, the card can work with what we got. We also have a couple of other things that we want to maintain from the original integrity. Bloodbraid Elf here, it has the Cascade mechanic. Again, for those of you who are a little unsure of how Cascade works, Bloodbraid Elf basically has this ability where when you cast the spell, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less than the elf. So in other words, 3 or less. You can cast the card without paying any mana if its value, of course, is less. And then you put the rest of the exile cards onto the bottom of your library in a random order. So again, very wordy, but again, all you do is when you cast the card, anything that costs 3 or less, and it's the first non-land card that pops up, you'll get to play it for free. With that, the only other cards that we want to maintain from the original ones are Liliana of the Veil here. Excellent Planeswalker, helps us with the discard, makes our opponent have to sacrifice a creature, so really good if your opponent is not playing any types of super go-wide strategies. And the only other card I would highly recommend from the original set, of course, is Scavenging Ooze. Instant graveyard hate right here, gets stronger, helps you stabilize with some life gain. But for the 1-drop slot, even though technically this card is still very popular, it's still, of course, still part of the original build of it, which is Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek. As far as your other cards that are going to help round out the package to modernize the whole deck, you have Fatal Push here, awesome creature removal in the early game. We're going to utilize Orcish Bowmasters here. Yes, the card has been nerfed thanks to alchemy changes and updates here.
Well, this stinks.
But it's still an awesome card, and I honestly think it still is decent, even if it's been severely pushed back from what it originally was. With that, we also have a light bit of removal with Sheoldred's Edict. We have Assassin's Trophy as our catch-all removal. Going into the 3-drop slot, we now have, of course, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Really awesome card, and ideally, if you can get this off of a Bloodbraid Elf, it is super awesome to have. Of course, we have Brotherhood End as our only main deck removal, but it also destroys all artifacts, so this is actually pretty solid for us. And if we need to deal with enchantments, we have a single copy of Glissa Sunslayer. Little spice in my opinion, but I think it really helps the deck round out a little bit more of its balance. Also, if it can do some combat damage to a player, you can either choose to draw a card, you lose a little bit of life, destroy an enchantment, or remove up to 3 counters from a target permanent. So really solid and very flexible for us with our game plan. I know there's going to be some people out here that don't agree with this choice, but of course, in order to make sure Jund is just as scary as always, our other final part of the game plan is Sheoldred the Apocalypse. As for your land base, it's going to be a giant hodgepodge of everything. So this is, of course, where also the expenses of the deck go up. So with that, besides, of course, your 3 swamps, your 2 mountains, and 3 forests, you're going to have, again, a bit of everything. You have a Hive of the Eye Tyrant for more graveyard hate. Den of the Bugbear can help you go wide if you need to. Your Boseiju is your artifact and enchantment hate in the main deck. Blackleaf Cliffs, Blood Crypts, Blooming Marsh, and Overgrown Tombs. You'll notice that we balance this in a specific way where we don't have 4 ofs. The reason why for that is you honestly want to try to maintain, again, the fast lands. That's mostly what you want to prioritize, because the way you want to play, of course, this deck, and I'll mention this a little bit more in the strategy, is you want to ideally curve out and minimize the damage to yourself as much as possible and try to go 1-for-1 versus your opponent. Normally, we don't honestly talk too much about sideboard when we do these small deck techs, but for this one, you actually have some customization options, and I'm going to pull them out right now so you can see if you do want to take this into best of 3. Honestly, it really comes down to what you personally want to do and also what's going on in the meta. So here's just going to be a bunch of 1-ups that I could recommend, and it really depends on how much of a feel, whether you want to maintain the original integrity of the Jund style of gameplay, or if you want to try to modernize it for the new era. But otherwise, without further ado, we have Deathrite Shaman here, we have Grafdigger's Cage, Roiling Vortex, Dampening Spear, Murderous Rider, Field of Ruin, Ghost Quarter, Ancient Grudge, Tear Asunder, another copy of Brotherhood's End, Kolaghan's Command, Maelstrom Pulse, Domri, Anarcha Bolus, Chandra Torch of Defiance, and a personal favorite of mine, Slaughter Games. So in other words, you have a ton of other options if you want to sideboard in various things. You can even sometimes move out also Orcish Bowmaster here, maybe put that into the sideboard if you feel like it's not working as well, and maybe put in something else in the 1-drop slot. One of the sweet things, at least about Jund, is there is a lot of customization. There's a ton of cards now as of this year that you can really kind of mix and match to see what you work with. But either way, let's talk strategy about how you want to maintain Jund and the feel of how it originally played in the original modern format. Basically, your strategy with Jund is you want to play ideally as fair as you can. I know that sounds a little weird in 2023 where a lot of cards are just trying to combo off and go super crazy by cheating a bunch of stuff. But the whole idea with Jund is you want to play it where it's a 1-for-1 style of gameplay. So in other words, when you open up and you have that opening hand, you ideally want to have either an Inquisition of Kozilek, or you want to have a Thoughtseize to take a peek at your opponent's game plan and start figuring out what's going to be the best way to get to your victory. As you get to the 2-drop slot, of course, you then bring in that Orcish Bowmaster, or you bring in your Tarmogoyf if it's safe to do so, and then ideally start building from there. And if your curve works out perfectly for those first 3 turns, you should be able to strip your opponent's strategy of their hand with either that Liliana the Veil, some Thoughtseize, or maybe you're trying to build up your board to outvalue your opponent by cards using Fable the Mirrorbreaker or Glissa Sunslayer. If your opponent is starting to get a little ahead of you, that's where you have your copy of Brotherhood's End to come in. And of course, once the coast is clear, you can then build everything up with another Bloodblade Elf or a Shielder of the Apocalypse and finish off your opponent very easily by turn 4 or 5. However, in order to get there, one of the trickiest parts about playing Jund is also you want to sequence together what is going to work best versus your opponent. So this is where it comes really tricky to kind of analyze what is your opponent trying to do and how to act accordingly. There's going to be some turns where you might want to hold off that Assassin's Trophy because maybe it might be better off for you to use a Fatal Push instead and save the Assassin's Trophy for something that you may anticipate they're going to bring in. Likewise, you might have to keep some of your mana open and hold off for that Orcish Bowmaster. So in other words, if you know they're going to start drawing cards, make sure to then bring that back in immediately just before the card draw resolves, so that way you can get additional value. Don't be afraid, again, to do 1-for-1 trades with this deck. That's mostly what Jund is trying to focus on doing, is focus on just grinding out your opponent and eventually outvaluing them with your cards. The way, again, Jund gets to victory is not necessarily just straight up destroying certain things here or just trading with combat damage, but also eventually you'll start pulling the game away from your opponent as you get cards out like your Glissa, or you have your Liliana, or your Fable the Mirrorbreaker. And then eventually your opponent won't have the answers to deal with everything that that your deck is capable of doing. However, one of the big weaknesses to Jund is, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of cards that sadly will outvalue you because the way Magic plays in 2023 seems like everything is now trying to do everything all at once, which is unfortunate for Jund, as that's kind of the reason why it fell by the wayside, is many other decks just started pulling away because they can do so much more. However, I still have faith that this deck is still capable of doing that. If you want to give it a try, by all means, you have now a deck list that, personally, as you see from the gameplay footage, is still more than capable of handling its own. However, for those of you that are maybe a fan of Jund, but maybe you want to try different variants of it, as you can see on screen right now, I will place a couple of different versions. There are some budget decks out there that you can play that are Jund style that kind of still get the feel of what we're trying to do. Whether you like playing more of the sacrifice style, or maybe you want to play more of the control style, you have so many options now in this format. But otherwise, the only other thing I just want to say is we are going to, of course, go back to some full deck techs. I'm going to put up, of course, some other smaller ones throughout this week because, again, we're taking a small little break where we're just going to do some more lighter stuff. But don't worry, as you can see, of course, with all of the previews that have been going on from the last Caverns of Ixalan, we're very close to yet another set. It feels like we were only just a month ago just talking about the previous set. Time flies really quick here. But the point I'm trying to make is, don't worry, we're of course looking at some full awesome new deck techs that we're going to be building very soon. So thanks again for hanging in there, everybody. But otherwise, my final thoughts I just want to give on the deck is whether you're an old school player who wants to relive the glory days of what it was like to play Modern Jund, remixed and redone for 2023 in Arena, if you're maybe a younger player who didn't know what it was like to play one of the most powerful and at the time most expensive decks for the Modern format, either way, however you slice it, if you manage to put this together, I know it is an expensive deck, but if you are willing to make the investment to make it work, you'll definitely have a lot of fun doing so. It'll be so satisfying to do it, and until at least we get Fetch Lands, this is probably as good as it's gonna get for Jund. But either way, you're gonna have a lot of fun if you do play it, and I assure you, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.